And we are live with a session that I think is probably best defined as a scourge of our economies and our societies today. It's often hidden. People don't acknowledge it because when you talk about modern slavery, I know all of the activists and leaders we have here today, and many amongst you in the audience will know people say to you, but slavery was eliminated. Well, no, sadly, on the contrary. So today we're going to talk about modern day slavery, and we're going to look at it as legislated disempowerment. And indeed, it is tragic for all of the people here who've worked with those workers, or indeed people who've been forced into trafficked environments. Then this is not a world that is acceptable by any standards, by any rule of law. And yet, sadly, we've had a lot of trouble getting the rule of law to keep pace with the dehumanising abuse of modern slavery. For me personally, I'm Sharon Burrow. I'm the General Secretary of the ITUC, the workers' movement around the world. Today is the World Day for Decent Work. And it was too glaring to put up the photo of our logo on the screen. But I don't have to tell you that in this convergence of crisis, from inequality, from climate action, from indeed COVID-19, that rebuilding the world of decent work and a new social contract is absolutely vital. But in that, we cannot leave those who are forced into modern slavery behind. And so this session has a very simple ambition. It's to shed light on the state of workers, the exacerbated dehumanisation of working conditions that are not actually in any way, shape or form living up to the ILO standards and that we have negotiated, or indeed human rights standards around the world. The C20 has made previous commitments to this area of work and to bridging female participation in the labour market, because the face of migrant workers is indeed predominantly female, and they are overwhelming the workers forced into forced labour or modern slavery. So whether we're talking about human trafficking, child labour, forced labour, women play a huge role in that world, and we need to be conscious that their rights and inclusion are fundamental. So civil society is calling for greater determination in these efforts. All of us would support that, and that's why we're here today. You cannot ignore the fact that that's even more greatly exposed with COVID-19, with stranded migrant workers, with employers around the world simply abandoning workers that had previously been in forced employ in their care. And we need the transparency, we need the rule of law, whether it's supply chains or whether it's indeed domestic work. The issue of due diligence, of the rule of law having due diligence with grievance and remedy at the heart of government legislation everywhere to affect compliance with human and labour rights is fundamental. And of course, how do we then transition those workers into decent work with support for secure jobs and, of course, the skills they need for the future. So we have a lot to talk about, and I'm very proud to be the moderator of such a distinguished panel. I want to simply tell you who's on our panel very briefly, and then hand it over to them to talk about the key areas of work in this frame. We have Yvonne Benson Idahosa, who is the founder and executive director of Pathfinders, the Justice Initiative. Jasmine O'Connor, who's the chief executive officer of Anti-Slavery International, with huge history in battling these issues. Justin Currell is the executive director of Unseen UK, says it all in the title. Sean McDonald is the chief executive officer of Verite, and again, an organisation that's fought every social justice issue you can think about. Thomas Vissing, who is the head of Advocacy and Partnerships Unit at the Fundamentals branch of the ILO. And of course, we relied desperately on the ILO for supervision and enforcement and the technical skills to make that possible. If I can just add for a moment that as we're looking at the numbers of people enslaved in forced labour, it was an ILO, ITUC, Qatari government partnership that after 3 long years and 5 or 6 years of campaigning before that with Human Rights Watch, with Amnesty, with ourselves, that we've just seen laws in place to see off the kafala system in that country. And I can tell you with the ILO, we plan to see off kafala in every Gulf country. So, Thomas, your work is vital. And Diane Mull is the Executive Director and President of the Board of Directors for the International Initiative to End Child Labour. And any of you who saw Kailash's recent seminar demanding justice in terms of recovery money spent for children and a fair share, then you'll know that this work is critical. So let's get to it. Yvonne, I think it's important that you open up because you can tell us in practical terms how legislated disempowerment is being reflected in the day-to-day lived experience of the people you see in the context of the work you're doing. So, Yvonne.
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. My name's Yvonne Idahosa, and I work with the organization that I founded, Pathfinders Justice Initiative, and we work with survivors of sex trafficking who are generally trafficked overseas, generally to Europe, but increasingly to the Middle East. And so by the time these women return back to Nigeria, it's, they're really, really returning in broken pieces in many ways. Most of them have had to have sex, with anywhere between, 10, 15, 20 men a day, over the period of about 2.5 to 3 years. And so, I think the reality is that when they're coming back, the expectations, I think, that many people ordinarily would have in the West are not quite reflected in the reality of what our survivors are facing and dealing with. And so for me as an African woman, I think, what I find to be consistent in almost every sphere that I show up in is that, the bodies of African women are probably the most weaponized, the most legislated and disempowered in the world. And so I think that as we have this conversation today, it's important to think not just about the legislation that's written, the way that we sort of traditionally think about legislation, but in developing countries, particularly in some African countries, there's 2 parallel systems of legislation, right? So there's a traditional system that many people adhere to, and also what we think of as the civil law. And so both of these intersect in many ways to continue to disempower women in through the legislation and through what's written into our laws. It's in our customs, it's in our traditions. And so I think it's important that we also recognize the import of these double or parallel systems on the lives and the mindsets of women. And so I think what we tend to see is that you have generations of women that are disempowering themselves in some ways as a result of having this assault on their mindset and their humanity in many ways. And so the perceptions of themselves and what they believe that they can bring to the table is just an additional layer that we're having to deal with as activists and as advocates. And so for us, I think it's important that we're not just speaking truth to power in the traditional sense, but also speaking truth to the seemingly powerless, right? So my work is really trying to get these women to see themselves as much more than what our context has actually defined them, and the definition that even the West sometimes legislates against them and their bodies. And so for us, it's important that we include their voices to ensure that the current laws in Nigeria are aimed at empowering, that there's not this intentionality to keep women and the system broken in many ways, right? It's about bringing these voices to the table, ensuring that they have space at the table, and then, you know, breaking down some of the systems that are intentionally keeping them in this space of disempowerment.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I think that opens up an incredible array of challenges, because if you think about those key words, being totally disempowered, weaponising women's bodies, really looking at the way in which our governments focus on a set of issues that in fact marginalise or exclude totally the very heart of the victims who are impacted, whether it's in conflict or whether it's just in the development frame. So, Jasmine, I think it's really important then to listen to you, because not only of the history of anti-slavery, but you know how important the partnership between policymakers and civil society is. It's from our perspective, if there is no community for action, then policymakers won't act. So how do you actually think that policy, that civil society can actually inform policy and we can see real change because of that?
I think that's a fantastic question, and hello everybody. It's good to be here discussing these issues. From our perspective at Anti-Slavery International, the relationship between governments and civil society, and indeed big international agencies like the ILO, are critical to ending slavery. It's civil society that understands what is really going on. It's people in those communities, in those places, who have got that lived experience and are connected to the systems of oppression and understand why they are being enslaved. I think the challenge is to be able to get that understanding and information in a way that's not extractive, but a way that is genuinely collaborative in the policy dialogue process. So governments need to go into those environments, meet with people where they're at in a non-threatening way, and in a way that can really open up solutions and dialogue. At the heart of slavery is a power dynamic that is abusive. Whether it's a factory owner in Bangladesh needing to fulfill an order book for a global brand that is suddenly changed at a sort of force majeure reason because of COVID, or whether it's somebody at a grassroots community level being predated upon by sex trafficking paedophiles. It's always about power, and it's beholden upon the power owner, i.e. the governments, to actually step into spaces where they understand that power dynamic and they can really genuinely open up dialogue and hear solutions. So for corporates, for governments, for those that hold power, they have to understand that relationship and listen to the solutions and co-create the kind of practical legislation, but also policy that incorporates, real world putting into practice of that legislation. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. It's my fundamental request, really, that if we want to take this seriously, we have to invest in that dialogue.
Well, there's no doubt about that. If we don't invest in the dialogue, if we don't actually build the momentum that actually demands the policy shift, the legislative shift, and then, of course, the enactment and compliance of that rule of law, then we're not going to change the face of it. And indeed, Justin, as the Executive Director of Unseen UK, there's no doubt that you've seen the power of a movement that actually got one of the very first due diligence laws around anti-slavery. We might be critical of the lack of compliance and sanctions, but it actually did pave a pathway towards part of a broader due diligence framework. So, if we look at supply chains today, how effective is legislation in protecting vulnerable workers, and what more do we need to do?
Thank you, Sharon, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody today. So just very briefly, I am an executive director for the modern slavery charity Unseen. We run a modern slavery helpline here in the UK, but in my previous life, I was the senior policy advisor and actually drafted the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, which included transparency in supply chains. And so it's an issue that's very close to my heart. For me, I think we do have to look at the power dynamics, so absolutely key in terms of what Jasmine has just said. And I think the way in which we can do that is not only through legislation, but ensuring that that is enacted on. I think we focus too much on legislation sometimes. For me, having worked in this environment for many, many years, I know that legislation is a great framework, but it can also be a blunt instrument. And so what we need to do is say that we need that behaviour change. And if we don't get that behaviour change that sits alongside regulatory frameworks and legislation, that happens not only in individual countries, because what we saw is, yes, we started maybe a movement around looking much more at transparency in supply chains. Other countries, thankfully, have started to look at that and are probably now going further than the UK felt it was able to in 2015. But I think it's really important that we do corral different jurisdictions, that we do really understand that what we buy as consumers, and all of the work that we do at Unseen, where we work directly with survivors of all types of exploitation, sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, criminal exploitation and domestic servitude, that we see that these individuals are completely disempowered by that power dynamic. And at the heart of all of this is a real lack of understanding right across not only business and in some parts of government, but also within the general public. You know, as consumers, we all have a responsibility to understand where our goods and services are coming from. And if we don't have that understanding, how can we ever possibly know that the decisions that we make will fundamentally affect somebody further down the supply chain? And so we are so disassociated with those goods on the shelves when we go into a shop, that I think we need to start saying to business, look, you know, we started this journey 7 or 8 years ago in the UK. We now have legislation that requires businesses to state what they've done on a yearly basis. But unfortunately, we've still got nearly 4,000 businesses that have not produced their first statement. And that can't be true. That can't be right. We have people basically saying, this is not an issue for me. As long as somebody is not hitting us over the head with a stick, then we can continue doing what we do. And I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about. Absolutely agree with Yvonne and Jasmine. We really need to look at this. We need to look at the assumptions that we make around the vulnerabilities, the push and pull factors, and make sure that we don't do this in isolation. We've had too much time working in silos, working in isolation. It's about time that the global community stood up and realised that this is an issue. It might not be what we saw 200 years ago, but we are definitely on a wave with the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, with issues like Brexit for us in the UK, all of these issues, the lack of understanding around migrant workers and their needs, the lack of a regulatory framework that actually is effective across many of the sectors we look at. I think we are heading for a storm. And I think we really need to sit up and take notice and absolutely agree that we can only do this if we pull together, and that's right across civil society, regardless of what sector you work in. That's with governments, that's with major corporates, and it's making sure that we're all pulling in the same direction, and we can all make sure that we put at the heart of our policy and decision making those vulnerable individuals that are affected by what we're talking about today.
Well, that's I've got a whole set of questions for you, but I'm going to let all of the speakers contribute and then try and bring you back to some of the discussions. But I think following on from your remarks, and particularly, is legislation enough? Then, Thomas, you've got a whole lot of wisdom to share on this. But let me just remind people that the global rule of law is in place. We actually have almost universal ratification of Convention 29 on forced labour. I think 9 ratifications are missing. We have 45 countries already ratified the more recent Protocol 29, and indeed that brings the convention up to date. We have universal ratification on Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labour. And yet if you go to the whatever figures you want to put out there, but generally people say 40 million people are still enslaved. That doesn't include all the trafficking figures as far as I understand. There's 25 million in forced labour, 15 million in forced marriage, 25% estimated are children, 70% are women, and debt bondage is, of course, part and parcel of a primary principle of enslavement. But it doesn't include then the numbers in the kafala system across the Gulf states and indeed in some developed countries where, you know, the management of migration is less than optimum. So you can see this is a huge problem across the board. And so, Thomas, we have the rule of law. What do we need to do to cut through the issues that both, or all of our speakers, but that indeed Jasmine just raised about, is legislation enough?
Thank you very much, Sharon. That's really one of the core questions for this panel, I think. And you already rightly say that we have made a lot of progress in the ILO. And when I'm saying the ILO, I'm talking about commitments, consensus commitments from governments, workers' organizations, and employers' organizations on these standards, on a portfolio, let's say, of more than 187 labor standards. And these standards provide, let's say, an even level playing field for all countries so that no country that commits to these conventions feels tempted to search for a commercial or a competitive benefit on the international market using cheap labor, using child labor, exploiting people in forced labor, pushing down wages, imposing indecent working conditions. So the framework, as Sharon said, is there. The decent work agenda of the ILO provides lots of insights on how this can put into place. And as she also rightly remembers, we celebrate and we commemorate today the International Day for the Promotion of Decent Work. And if we look into three important principles also from the Philadelphia Declaration, which reconfirms the constitution of the ILO after the Second World War in 1944, there are 3 important principles that are still very valid for the discussion that we're having here. One is that labor should not be seen as a commodity, as a tradable. We're talking about human people, we're talking about, about human beings, we're talking about people, we're talking about values, we're talking about persons, we're not talking about a box of chocolates, or we're not talking about an industrial product or a service. It's a much broader discussion. A second very important point is that freedom of expression and freedom of association, including also the right to collective bargaining, are essential elements for sustaining progress. And I think it was already in one of the statements before, if workers are organized, if they have the chance to collectively raise their voice, if they can look at working conditions together with their employers and negotiate decent working conditions, and if there is appropriate legislation in place, then this is already in itself, maybe not a guarantee, but a very strong point to avoid that child labor, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation and modern slavery can happen. So the challenge here is also to see how we go from the implementation of these international labor standards from, let's say, the space where organized workers and organized employers are meeting in the formal part of the economy and take these conventions forward to where the real challenge lies, in the informal economy, because this is really where we face the broadest and the deepest challenges in terms of root causes of child labor, forced labor, trafficking. Poor people that have not the right to collectively bargain for a salary in agriculture, farm workers that have no access to organize in a union, domestic workers that are fearing that if they organize, they lose their possibility to stay in the country where they are, migrant workers that have the same concerns. They have a lot of difficulties to organize and to claim and to organize collectively for their rights. So yes, the rights are in the Constitution, they are in the labor laws, they are known to everybody, but they don't necessarily apply to everybody. We have to link the discussion to the concept of discrimination and exclusion, I think, if we want to make progress and see how we get these more vulnerable groups into the radar of collective agreements. And this means also empowering them, and that means basically working from three angles. We need to have clear governmental commitments to stick up with the international labor standards and to implement them in practice effectively in their countries. We need the workers to look at this and to reach out also to groups that are presently not fully represented in the unions. We need the employers to play a critical role here in looking into not only their own operations and their own company, but to make real due diligence efforts along their supply chains. And we need, and that has also been said already, we need to empower directly the victims and the survivors and the potential victims of exploitation. And that's basically what we need to look into in a package. I'm happy to give some examples maybe in a second round of discussion, but I leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Thomas. And Sean, forgive me, I deliberately switched the order because I think where the discussion led us was from the community of people who live daily lives in forced labour to the role of community advocacy and policy, then through legislative frames and the very vital questions that, you know, Justine posed and, of course, Thomas just built on about where does, in fact, regulation, the rule of law and practice kind of meet. And you, I know, I was going to ask you this, that if we're going to promote due diligence as mandatory, and indeed the EU is committed to mandatory due diligence, which I'm sure we all support, how do you actually make sure that in supply chains that promoting due diligence particularly involves as well human trafficking and what appears to be working and not working in regulations that we have to date, so we can inform the development, all of us, of broader due diligence legislation? So, Sean.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. It's a really great opportunity to join other civil society organizations in this global convening to talk about this topic. I think one thing that I wanted to highlight is the fact that Sharon and Thomas and Justine and Jasmine and others mentioned how we have these standards. So many countries have labor law there. We have ILO standards that so many people in this global community have fought for over the decades, but we really need to have a new generation of push for better corporate regulation. And I think some of the things to build on, including the transparency and supply chain regulations that we've seen, Justine mentioned it in the UK, obviously now in Australia, parts of Europe, in the United States, and certain states. We really need to build on that to enable civil society activists, trade unionists, and government officials to really hold companies to real standards that are based on sufficient, robust input from workers. And a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning are the new trends around trying to link human rights standards, particularly around human trafficking, the fight against human trafficking, to government procurement and to trade law, as well as to the push for mandatory human rights due diligence processes. The reason I think these are particularly clear is the transparency regulations that exist for corporations still don't have enough teeth. As Justine mentioned, many companies still haven't even put out proposals, put out statements about what they're doing, but the laws also only expect them to talk about commitments, vague commitments, the types of auditing they're doing, the way they're changing their policy. But if you look at some of the procurement regulations in the United States and certain parts of Europe, parts of Australia, this is really, really powerful because governments buy more goods and services than the private sector, certainly really large governments like here in the United States. They are more susceptible, I think, I hope, to public pressure through the democratic process to really push government officials to prioritize real clear standards for those who get the contracts using our taxpayer dollars. And so I think there's real momentum based on, say, the federal acquisition regulation that was promulgated by President Obama a number of years ago that prohibits certain trafficking practices. But we need civil society to really push governments, not just in the United States, but around the world to really have very clear standards and includes very specific due diligence mechanisms like genuine, independent grievance mechanisms for workers, a true role for trade unions at the table, actually pushing for numerical impact statements from companies. So not just saying what their policies have changed, but in what ways have their wages changed and what numbers have gone up or down about facilities that are unionized, hours of workers, and really expect these due diligence statements and due diligence processes to have actual numerical impacts statements, not just vague commitments. I think the other thing that's really important that we're seeing here in the United States, and I think is also being taken up in some other places where civil society can really rally around, is around the use of trade law to prohibit the trade in forced labor and child labor made goods. So here in the US, we amended our trade law to enable the government to ban the importation of goods made with forced labor. And the government is stepping up and doing that across the board, whether it's tobacco grown in Malawi with tenant farmers or garments made with forced labor by Uyghur workers in Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China or palm oil in Malaysia. This is what really gets the attention of business when their goods are stopped at the border or when they don't get contracts, because over the span of decades of corporate accountability activism by civil society, too often the small number of activists among us around the world can't hold all these companies accountable. So we really need those who have the power of the purse in procurement or control trade to understand these standards and incorporate them. I think the other exciting thing about mandatory human rights due diligence, building on the transparency accountability legislation that's already in a number of countries, is that it's across the board. It doesn't only target certain sectors or only companies that they get the attention of the media, the usual suspects, so to speak, because across the board of companies of a certain size. And that means that sectors where a spotlight hasn't been shining yet are then held accountable. And the same thing, if we can get those who do government procurement, those who control trade, to have really clear standards to choose, not among the good versus the bad, because there's not just a few bad apples here. We have forced labor across many, many sectors with lots of different companies. And so building out the right standards with really robust civil society input to say, these are the companies that are doing more, that are doing better, and this is how you push them to do more and do better over time, rather than just here are the good ones, here are the bad ones. These are the kinds of technical issues that civil society and trade unions and others who are committed to this fight against forced labor can band together to really help governments do their job better.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I thought this would work perfectly because, in fact, as we fight for due diligence, what are the, beyond just the rule of law, what are the implementation measures that change the practice? because the US law and the restrictions in terms of customs control, absolutely fundamental. You can have it in trade agreements, and we should. You can have procurement policies, and we should. But if, in fact, you are not providing the real kind of impetus for people to be able to not sell their goods because they'll be blocked by practical measures like that legislation. So we have to kind of have the scope, the rule of law globally, the domestic rule of law, due diligence, as Sean expresses it. How do we have the grievance procedures that allow us to expose the scandals of modern slavery, the dehumanizing scandals of our supply chains generally? And then how do we force it? What's the real enforcement mechanism that will prevent the corporate behavior? So, mind you, that also works for good companies, because we know that they're at a disadvantage when they do the right thing, make their supply chains transparent, and then the fly-by-nights continue to actually get away without any kind of barriers. So absolutely fundamental. How do we put this whole continuum of the rule of law and practice into place? And if, with all of us on the same team about this, I actually think we can get real shifts in the coming years. But Diane, I want you to bring us back to reality, because one of the sectors that is a scourge really is agriculture. So with all of the demands of people for food security, for, you know, climate resilient food, for, you know, the kind of future where we can be assured that the food we're eating is not wasted, the food we're producing is not wasted, then we see persistent and egregious human rights violations everywhere in agriculture. It's not just in the developing world. In fact, in the food industry generally, can I tell you, some of our fights are in Paraguay with indigenous people and cattle farming. They're in Italy with the need for ethical recruitment of migrant workers. And the new law on gang masters is good, but not enough. There's 22 Pathfinder countries that have signed Alliance 8.7 to eliminate child labour with the ILO and the UN, and yet of that 22 countries, that, you know, there is only 5 who've ratified the forced labour protocol. So you can see the disconnect between commitment and actual action. So Diane, I know that agriculture is kind of like often it's unseen. It's just unseen, to borrow that title. But we have the global rule of law. We see governments and major companies, however, every day ignoring it, simply ignoring it. And so the child labour, the forced labour that continues, I don't understand why we still have major companies in production and supply chain management still absolutely abusing this, pretending they're putting money often into foundations or into action, but still not eliminating child and forced labour in their supply chain. So Diane, what do we need to do? This is a big focus for you, I know, so here it is.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this illustrious group and to be on the panel. And everything that I've heard from all the other speakers say is absolutely correct, and we support that. One of the actions that IECL has been doing is at the farm gate level doing comprehensive social reviews. When we do these comprehensive social reviews, we look very specifically at the laws in the country, what standards, international standards they have complied with. And we also look very specifically at companies and businesses, but also farms, and what the farms are doing from the farm gate level. And then we track the supply chains and look at the engagement of the brands. And what we're seeing, and as you have just mentioned, the highest percent of child labor is in agriculture. It's the 4th highest in forced labor. it is trafficking for employment that occurs often. And it's 11th in the world, and the 11% of the world's migrants work in agriculture. And it's considered one of the most hazardous of occupations. Yet in every country, and we've done this in 12 countries with the numerous commodities and agriculture related commodities, it's the most labor intensive as far as very short periods of employment, but yet it is the most underregulated and often exempt in its own country laws. So where you will have standards that are applicable to other businesses, agriculture will be exempt. And it's in large part due to the perception that it's impossible for a small farm to operate in any sophistication. It's generally a perception that informal businesses can't do it either. But the reality is that farms, as well as informal businesses, they recruit workers, they hire workers, they fire workers, they handle remuneration, they are handling human resource management, yet they are not held to the same standard as any other business. But yet they're doing all of those practices, but the perception is that they can't. And so unless, and often what we find is that there's very little enforcement that's taking place in the agricultural sector. It's easier to do, well, somewhat easier to do an enforcement when you have a building and you're walking into the building. But the enforcement going into an agricultural farm, which is very widespread, often very difficult to access without advance notification, the enforcement isn't happening. And it has, I think, it's tied to both internal and external issues. The internal issues being there's not been an investment to assist at the farm gate level producers to understand how they're handling how they are doing recruitment. They don't even register the workers. They don't know who's in the farm working. They're trying to treat any workers as independent contractors as opposed to recognizing them as actual employees. They're not, they're exempt from the law, or there's a perception in the country that these laws don't apply to agriculture. It never has, and there's no reason to do it. And also, you have as in external factors, lack of development in rural areas. So you don't have the same types of access to beyond primary school. You don't have access to middle schools or vocational technical skills training or adult education for illiterate or low literacy producers or workers. You have a huge pool of very high risk, disadvantaged people who are desperate to find employment. And as a result, they are willing to allow themselves, when there's a need for employment to make money, they're willing to work and subjugate themselves to this situation because they are in desperate need. So when we have an investment from the international level, and we do major investments into rural development or into aid programs that are supporting agriculture or construction, we need to ensure that those international programs don't have unintended impacts of actually facilitating child labor and forced labor trafficking and those kinds of situations. There's few policies that the agricultural sector has to comply with because they're so politically powerful in the countries that if a law is, for example, in some of the countries who have signed, when it comes to a regulation like occupational safety and health or basic employment rights for workers, agriculture often can manipulate itself to be exempt. And it's been allowed. And it's because of some of the perceptions that I've talked about. And because you don't have a workforce that is really organized or strong enough to be able to voice for themselves the exploitation that's taking place at the field level, at the farm gate level. So you have a large pool of at-risk people who are illiterate, low literacy, with few opportunities, and a sector who can, when they are under attack, if you would, from having regulations being applied, who can call in the restaurants, grocery stores, who can call in agrochemical companies, who can call in equipment companies to support their being exempt. So when you're fighting an issue with agriculture, you're not just fighting the farms or farmers or even the brands who are selling their individual commodities. You're up against a huge conglomerate of businesses that are all interrelated and they're all intersupported. And so it takes a concerted effort to remove those exemptions and to ensure that the policies are inclusive and consistent, that is applicable across all business sectors, that agriculture is not exempt, that the workers, and to know that the workers who are working in agriculture are largely at risk, they're immigrant, they're migrants, they are minority, is a more egregious form of discrimination under the law. So the legislative disempowerment is very inherent in the exceptions, in the exemptions, and that's where we really need to focus, because we've seen it consistently in all of the countries where we have worked and done the comprehensive social reviews.
Well, indeed, the farm gate review or assessment, I think that's a fabulous tool. And if we could link those results, Diane, to all of our work. So as you said, we bring in all the actors for exposure, then I think that would make a great deal of difference. I've got a quick question, and it's probably a 30-second answer from each of you or those who want to address it. But can I ask the Secretariat, I didn't set up a second device or have a minder helping, and I can't access the Google Doc. So if there are key questions from our audience that I know you're pasting because they're not in the chat, then can you actually, I'll come to you and can you just tell us what they are and I'll direct traffic. So always possible to manage this despite the technical challenge. On the question, if you go back to what Thomas said, he talked about freedom of association. In a way, that's how workers are empowered, how they're exposed, but also social protection. How do we actually prevent the issue? And so I wanted to really focus on that. If you had universal social protection with, access to incomes when you didn't have work, or indeed a minimum income in the context of everybody in that social protection frame, would that actually help us with prevention? Would domestic workers leave the country in search of jobs because they're desperate to help their families, knowing that they're going into exploitative condition? Would children be forced to work because there's no other choice? Is part of a universal social protection floor a minimum income? And should we be fighting for that as a preventative measure? Let's start with Justine. What do you think, Justine?
So I think that is a fantastic aspiration, but I also think it's it's a real challenge, and it's something that we have looked at across the piece in terms of how do we provide those social protections that will mean that, as you quite rightly said, people don't leave their home countries to look for a better life, and that's a lot of what we see here in the UK. Coming to somewhere else where you don't know the rule of law, where you don't know the potentially the local language, and you're at a disadvantage within that environment before you even start. So I think it's a great aspiration to have. However, I know just from my previous life within the Home Office and in the UK government, the challenge not only within our own context and our own jurisdictions, trying to manage how we would achieve this globally, to me it seems, as I said, very aspirational, but also something that we should always aspire to.
Well, we wouldn't have some of the conventions and the rules of law that we have today if we didn't start somewhere. So we are actually campaigning for a global social protection fund for the poorest countries, and it would be based on income and access to health. But Jasmine, do you think this is something we should join forces around, a universal income on which people can live? Would that help prevention?
I think it would.
Or not?
I think it would if it's done well. And I mean, there are a number of ways that has been rolled out around the world that it has worked. So I think it needs to be looked at. It needs to have the political will behind it, whether it's a living wage or whether it's universal basic income, whichever mechanism we go for, it needs to have the political will behind it. But I'd also say that I think that will capture a certain amount and challenge and tackle a certain amount of slavery. But I think we also need to understand some of the other drivers. And I think there is always going to be discrimination. There is always going to be othering of individuals. And there's always going to be individuals who seek to exploit and use sort of trickery and coercion in order to gain wealth in excess for themselves. And so I do think that it is a part of the solution, but it is absolutely not the whole solution. We do need to look at some of those anti-discriminatory measures alongside universal income or sort of living wage type options. And within all of that, I think the importance of understanding how a sort of carrot and stick approach can work, and how we do need to ensure that traffickers are brought to justice, that victims of slavery are supported to be able to have sustainable freedom, so that they don't end up in a revolving door and re-traffic, but are actually able to be a part of bringing their traffickers or their exploitative employers to justice. Because I think all of those pieces need to sit together in our solution toolbox, as it were.
So yes, but not sufficient. Ruth, Yvonne, sorry, I was going to come to you next and ask you indeed, would it help, but who would it exclude? How do we make this so that it's universally a foundation for people to prevent the choices of them being forced into modern slavery?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's aspirational, and in the reflection in my work with women, I think one of the things that's always very clear is that people tend to look at the victims, at the survivors, as or exclude their voices in many ways from the solution. So I think unless there's a dialogue that's created that incorporates all of these voices, you're not going to ultimately have what it is that we're aspiring to achieve. I think part of the issue too is that there's not really a focus on the demand from all of these countries, whether it's the effect of globalization across the board, or just addressing the fact that the bodies, in my context, of African women are in high demand in European countries, and that people are still willing to pay a certain amount of money to be able to have access to that. And so for us, it's simple economics, right? It's demand and supply. And so if you are planning to introduce something like this, I think it's important that everyone sort of looks at themselves in the mirror and really asks the question of how am I contributing to all of this? How is my role as an Italian man all the way in Italy? How is that affecting decisions and choices, or limiting decisions and choices for women that are thousands and thousands of miles away? And so it really does have to be something that is inclusive in the design of all of these marginalized voices, and then inclusive in the implementation as well.
Okay, so there we have it. We have to include everybody. I think no one on this panel would disagree with that. But I just, Diane, I want to come back to you, because one of the questions is very instructive of what we will face, not just now, but in the future. And one of the questions was, how will technology indeed make the potential for it being even worse? Because as people lose their jobs through technological advancement, onshoring, do you think that will affect agriculture in the same way it will affect manufacturing? And in that context, what role does social protection and minimum income play?
I think in agriculture, the technology and the focus has been on tree stock, or the actual plant itself being resistant to disease and resistant to climate change and things of that nature, and a certain level of technology with equipment that can come into play, and the types of chemicals that are used in fertilization and those areas. So technology has a role to play to a certain degree, but it doesn't really benefit the workers. And I think that technology also, with respect to improving some of the recruitment and the human resource management of how the employers are handling workers, could be of benefit to ensure that workers are recognized as actual employees within the farms. If I could, I would like to focus on the question that you had before about a living wage. One of the issues in agriculture is at the farm gate level, while the producers and the workers are yielding a crop, once that crop moves up the supply chain, and then once it reaches the consumer, I'll give coffee as an example. A cup of coffee could sell for $3 a cup to the consumers, yet the producers get maybe 25 cents of that $3. And as a result, some conventional production practices mean that the small farms are not able to even earn a living wage. And as a result, any workers that are working in their farms are even receiving less. So unless you can really figure out a mechanism in which the producers can receive an adequate percentage of their commodity, they're not going to be able to meet any standards or, comply with due diligence that are requirements for the brands, and the brands have these expectations of the producers, yet there's no support coming from the brands to the producers for them to implement the actions to bring about the change. So there's got to be that connection between the two. Also, with respect to migration and the situation, we see rural flight to urban areas, which is compounding urban sprawl and urban poverty pockets. And also workers who are leaving geographic areas to move someplace else for the perception of good employment. That attraction is because of a failure of an adequate workforce development strategy in those sending countries, or where the migrants are coming from. If there was an effective workforce development strategy that really targets the at-risk, disadvantaged, those who are more easily tricked, trapped, and exploited. If you have an effective workforce development strategy in those sending areas, and then you have interventions that are organized to address those unique issues that are created, such as the Venezuelan migrants moving to Colombia, and now they're hugely entering the the coffee sector in Colombia. There needs to be an organized plan and strategy as to how you're going to address this before it becomes an exacerbated situation and you create or have resulting huge problems that didn't exist before because there was not a migrant population in the coffee harvest. So I think it's the planning and it's the interventions, but a workforce development strategy and the connection between a living wage and the ability to pay decent wages for workers needs to be the connections and brand involvement at the international level to the farm gate level.
Indeed. And of course, they're two separate issues, aren't they? We definitely need a living wage. If people don't have a minimum living wage, as we call it, based on evidence about what it takes to live, and they're actually in work, then that's just, inhuman and shouldn't be allowed to be perpetrated on anybody. And we should hold those brands, Diane, indeed, to account internationally. But secondly, of course, the poorer, the farmer, often is the victim of that too, because if you don't pay them enough for the contract, then passing on that living wage is impossible. So I think there's a joint piece of framing for action there. Then, of course, there is the income or a guaranteed minimum income that comes in social protection, where you're not in work or you don't have enough work. And so we need to marry those two things, absolutely, as you indicated. But holding companies to account is actually one of the other questions from our audience. And the shock was expressed that even major companies who would otherwise be seen to be reputable either didn't pay for orders or were paying only part of the wage that they'd been paying pre-COVID. So first of all, I was going to ask Sean, are you seeing this as well in the work that, you've identified? And then I want to go to Thomas and say, well, what instruments do we have to deal with that? And how can we marry the due diligence, the exposure people have seen, and indeed potentially complaints processes where governments aren't holding companies to account. So Sean.
Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, we are seeing that in our work around the world. And I think one way to look at it or to think about how to make sure that companies aren't facing impunity for that kind of egregious behavior is to think about how we in the civil society community around the world can actually build in more transparency around those behaviors into the due diligence processes that we're proposing. So if we try to connect the dots on some of these conversations we've been having the past half hour, if we're saying that it's important for global civil society to push for mandatory human rights due diligence, to have more transparency, it's incumbent on us to put in particular requirements there to say, these are the kinds of data points that we insist on seeing. Did you pay a living wage? Did you pay a minimum wage? Even just, yes, obviously living wage still is aspirational, but we have minimum wages in every country, sometimes not in the agricultural sector, as Diane mentioned, but obviously there's a sense of what wages are. Companies have that data. They've had it for a long time. And so we can push for inclusion of that data. We can push for more inclusion of information about how value is shared or not, usually not shared well within the value chain, to get down not just to what are the wages people are paid, but most people, particularly in particularly vulnerable countries, don't get wages. They may get a share of something. They might get a price. And very often it's not enough to cover their costs. And so we need to ask companies and demand companies within these human rights due diligence processes to be transparent about how value is shared, what prices are paid, and what wages are paid. So I think that's one way that we can kind of think about how to take these aspirational goals of meeting minimum wage, pushing minimum wage higher to a living wage, marrying that to this basic social protection floor. That also gets to this issue of how to hold companies more accountable as we move into the fourth industrial revolution with more, not just more outsourcing to poor countries that's been going on for decades, but more automation, because then we can really look at the data of what companies are doing about shedding jobs or shifting over to machines or to artificial intelligence, and how that's having an impact on workers. So what I'm really saying is we need to take these data points of vulnerability around lost jobs, around not enough value being shared in the supply chain, around wages, and expect those data points to be shared by companies, not just through mandatory human rights due diligence and transparency regulations, but as I said before, in the tenders for procurement. And then really importantly, what civil society can do, because obviously we as a group are so much less powerful than companies, than governments, or from the financial sector. But how can we try to hold investors more responsible for demanding this data and making decisions in their investments and in their financing around some of these data points? Now, the amount of information isn't sufficient for people to make good decisions, but we in civil society can push for those data points to be surfaced so that those with power can make better choices.
Well, absolutely. And Thomas, you know, how do you see this? What is it that we can do to marry those kind of practical examples of activism and exposure with the rule of law? How can we help with, you know, perhaps complaints against those companies? What tools do people have out there, well, countries, I should say, at the ILO?
Yes, maybe thanks, Sharon. If I may, I would maybe jump on what Sean said and then develop the idea. Because I think it is indeed crucial that companies do not only make a commitment not to use child labor in the supply chain, or just make sure that from a risk perspective or from a compliance perspective, they are, let's say, clean from human rights violations, but that they really engage to be part of the solution and to work with local governments and with unions and with others to ensure that those people at the end of the supply chain indeed have a decent income from their work or from universal social protection force. And that also brings governments into the play. So we need to work. I think governments are very much here on the forefront also to be accountable for that. And business can indeed push for that if they put in place these sort of policies. I give an example. I happen to be the director of our office in Mexico for a while, and we started a project with the sugar industry to eliminate child labor. They were coming to the ILO because they said we have a new trade agreement that was in 2008, 2009, which obliges us to be more competitive. We need to be more productive. We want the ILO to help us with the human resource policies and productivity. We said, yes, okay, we do that. But it should be bound also to human rights standards and labor standards, like eliminating child labor, forced labor, and so on and so forth. They said, no, that's not a problem for us. That's far down the supply chain. We are just the industry. Everything is clean here. We have labor inspection. We have unions. That's not a problem for us. We said, look, apart from the risk, there is also an ethical argument here. And if you want to compete on the international market on the basis of ILO standards, that's something you need to look into. But we started helping them with improving their productivity and their enterprise development to make sure they had sufficient margin also, and they felt more comfortable to look into this human rights approaches more seriously. But with a clear commitment and with a time plan to put these things into place. And after some difficult initial years, they finally committed in 2012 to work backwards through the supply chain until the very end, to make sure that in the whole supply chain of sugar in Mexico until 2020, so in the framework of 8 years from 2012 to 2020, there would not be any child labor anymore in the sugar production. And they put this into practice with real commitments and with the support from the ILO. So that's a partial answer for what you're saying, Sharon, on how this can be put into practice. And then in some cases, like the ones you know, in Qatar, in many other countries, we also help to establish neutral complaint mechanisms where workers can confidentially and without the fear to being fired for their complaint, make complaints about their working conditions, about their salaries, about withholding passports, about other violations of their workers' rights, with the support of the ILO or with the support of independent judicial institutions that care for the confidentiality of this information. And then they work with the labor inspection and with the labor ministries to make sure that these people will be considered to have better working conditions and that their rights will be respected. So the setting up of these complaint mechanisms parallelly to the implementation of the international labor standards, that's also a good way to go. And then there is, of course, I don't go in detail with this right now, but all the, let's say, the machinery of the supervisory mechanism of the ILO on how countries comply with the mechanism. So on all the ILO conventions, there is an obligation to the ratifying countries to report back to the ILO with different timeframes. There is a committee of experts on the supervision of standards and recommendations that's looking into these reports. Governments and workers' organizations have an opportunity also to make their comments on what the governments say. And I think we need to bring in civil society more and more into these processes also. And they are already very vocal on some of the violations they see. And that can be taken into consideration also. And then on the basis of these supervisory procedure, the ILO emits, well, the committee of experts emits recommendations to the country to address certain human rights violations. And these are public reports, so it's accessible for civil society organizations, for the advocacy work in the countries, to hold governments accountable for things they say they are already properly addressed, but maybe they have not been properly addressed yet. You see, so it looks sometimes very weak, very soft law, but if you really use it smartly, it can have a really substantive impact in driving change.
Well, it's a general invitation indeed to the audience where we have clear-cut violations of the global rule of law for working people. Let's document them and see what use we can make together of not just the ILO supervisory complaints and complaint system, but indeed of other UN mechanisms. And I know there's a lot of terrific special rapporteurs that are always looking for cases to highlight the violations and so on. So it's an invitation generally to the people out there. And I know that, Yvonne and Jasmine and Justine and Sean and Diane all have experience, and we should probably be doing more together to highlight these abominable violations of human and labour rights, because it is all about dehumanising treatment of people who are our brothers and sisters around the world collectively. There are no more questions from the audience, so I have one of my own, because I think, okay, there is one about COVID-19, but I'll wrap it up in conclusion. So let me focus on something I don't think we've put enough time on yet. We touched on the edges, but how do we prevent women actually being forced into making choices that are simply desperate choices, even where they know they're going into dehumanising environments, where they're going to be exploited, because their commitment is first and foremost to their families, to support their families, to not be a burden on their families, a whole range of motivation. And so in that environment, what is it that we need to do to increase the labour participation rates of women in their own countries, as well as seeing equal and decent treatment in the countries of destination? So I'm going to start with Jasmine, who I know has done lots of thinking around this, but then I'm going to get the other women first to come in, and then we'll wrap it up on time by coming back to a reflection about the current environment. But Jasmine.
Well, I think I'm going to link my answer to the COVID context, actually, because what we're seeing in the COVID context is that disproportionate burden that falls upon women, and women are often being overrepresented in the informal economy, experiencing the kind of exacerbation of that vulnerability as a result of COVID, the pressure on family finance, and the pressure actually that starts to fall not just on women but their children as well, in terms of child labour and potentially child slavery, early and child forced marriage, those kinds of forms of slavery being sort of really on high alert in the COVID context. And I think the only thing I can say is that we need a systemic approach to this. We need an approach that looks at the law, that looks at the informal legal systems as well, as Yvonne was highlighting earlier, but also looks at the norms and the behaviours in society, that understands that role of discrimination, that puts women in places where they are excluded from the formal forms of employment, as it were. And I think if I were to just sum it up in a few words, it would be education, education and education. We know that the development and the access that women have to education significantly changes a woman's chance in life. And so I think, coming back again to COVID, the challenge of that's put upon education and the sort of invisible, sort of toll that children are taking in this pandemic, is something that has to be addressed if we're going to find the right mix of both sort of legal and policy instruments to make sure that actually we aren't looking at a sort of forgotten generation of girls and women who end up in slavery in sort of, not just now, but in years to come. So yes, touch point across all the SDGs effectively.
Well, and there's no doubt that wrapped up both our questions. And as a woman who started her working life as a teacher, then the education brings music to my ears, because if you have education, if you have the dignity of decent work, and you have social protection, you have all of the tools really to face a future of hopefully better opportunity. So, but Yvonne, I was struck earlier by your discussion about women's bodies being weaponised and how that disempowers them even further. How do we make sure that those women have a capacity not just for the kind of support and reparations they should be justifiably entitled to, but a chance both in a preventative and in a remedy sense to be able to participate fully in decent work?
Right. I think one of the things I always say is that, women in and of ourselves are not vulnerable, right? In many ways, we're intentionally rendered vulnerable. And I think what we've seen is that legislation alone obviously can't mitigate those vulnerabilities. You actually have to address the underlying vulnerabilities that are intentionally created by the system itself. In my context, what we see is women who start to deem prostitution as an alternative to poverty, right? And to some of the things that they don't feel that they have access to. And so that's, certainly one of the things that we try to create is to open up those doors, right? Invite them into the conversation, really ensure that their voices are actually included. I mean, at my organization, organization, we have a group that we call The Voice. And before we actually create any intervention, we bring these people together. It's made up of survivors. It's made up of women who were unsuccessfully recruited. It includes traffickers. It includes, recruiters, and they frame what's going to be effective for them, right? And so when we take out these voices and think that people who are sitting in air-conditioned offices across the world are going to have the sort of impact, it's international. It's almost it's intellectually dishonest, I think, in many ways, and prideful to think that your solution that worked in Bangladesh is simply going to work in Venezuela just because they're women, and so the fact that you were not taking into account the intersectionalities that many women have to deal with about their gender, about their sexuality, about their race, ethnicities. I mean, the fact that you're ignoring all of those things and expecting a solution that is actually going to work is it's child's play, in many ways. And so I think it's just really about granting women access, but access based on what they are telling you that they need.
I couldn't agree more, and that reminds us all really that, going right back to the freedom to have the voice, to have it respected, the freedom of association, of speech, of assembly, all of those fundamental human rights is actually critical, but so too is the respect that all of us provide by opening spaces for people to be deterministic about their own solutions and how that fits then with legislation, policy, and the rule of law. Indeed, I have a love-hate relationship myself, even with the word empowerment, because I always say, look, women have power. Women have power. It's only when they're being denied en masse by conflict or weapons or government legislation or simply systemic discrimination that, in fact, that's denied to them. So you're absolutely right. But, Diane, I've heard, through my own travels and workers' hearings, as we call them, terrible, heart-rending stories from women, who are in agriculture, who, aren't even allowed, without facing violence, to pick up their own paychecks because men step in front of them, let alone the dehumanising experience I've seen for women in the melon fields of, Honduras, or, all those areas that come to mind when we think about what this is like. So what's your view about how we include women, how we give them proper access to decent work?
I think part of the issue is that with the employer, requiring that the employer recognizes that every individual is a worker and that you don't allow the situations of the head of household, being the male oftentimes, viewed that way as the person who receives the paycheck, and then no one else, including children and the spouse, are recognized as being legitimate workers. And so I think it's requiring that each economic unit that is operating as a business has to meet critical human resource management requirements. Informal business, agriculture, all of them can do it. It can be very simple, but basic steps that are taken so that it recognizes individually women as well as men, and it recognizes who all are in the workplace and who all are contributing their work, and that each of them are valued for the contributions that they make. I know a lot of investment has been toward the producer, the owner of the business. That's where all the education is done for the producer. Yet it is the spouse of the producer who is cooking for the workers, who is managing actually payroll records, who is actually the one who's writing down everything and keeping track of what records are kept. But yet they are not, there's no investment in their education and training. I think it's the education and employment development planning that is failing. There's been more of an approach to one size fits all in workforce development strategies rather than bringing it down to very specific, customized education and development planning for the individual. And thinking about, as Yvonne mentioned, understanding the context within which a woman is operating, you know, what her situation is, and understanding that and taking that into context when you are designing an education plan or you're designing or setting employment objectives. We really need to think in a holistic way about their current situation and how this affects them in their achieving education and employment goals.
So we're running top of the hour pretty fast. So I'm going to ask our last three panelists, literally in 1 minute, to, you know, not just to reflect on what we've heard, because I think everybody actually does understand the power of voice and the rights working people have, whether they're formal or informal or, you know, part of a community working environment, to actually have a say in their own future. But I was going to ask our last three speakers, one policy area you think we need to move on and move on with urgency, to bring it back to how we marry that local voice to actually effectively holding companies, governments, and indeed international agencies to account. Going to start with you, Sean. One minute, one policy area we need to move on with urgency.
One policy area, okay. I would say that finding the right way to manage migration and migration corridors between poor and richer countries is a really impactful way to try to reduce modern day slavery, human trafficking. These, again, there are systems in place, there are standards from the ILO as well as at the national level. There are all sorts of commitments by the private sector to do this. It's obviously complicated, but it's also not so complicated that it's impossible to do a lot better. Obviously, Sharon, you will at ITUC as well as with ILO and the Qatar government, as you mentioned before, put a lot of work into this and obviously it's just getting started, but it is a system that's possible to fix and certainly to improve dramatically based on existing statutes. And this is where, again, we focus on the data points of fees, who's paying them, who should be paying them, who's not, worker input, yeah. There we go. That's a big impact area.
Definitely the political will to manage migration and hold people to account for it, absolutely, without question. Indeed, Thomas, you know, one of the challenges there is we can't get any agency to map properly where stranded workers are in the context of COVID-19. So I know you have a lot to offer, but in 1 minute, how do we get a map of where stranded workers are so we can all act on making sure they're not being totally isolated as we know they are in this current crisis?
Well, I think it's important to work with multi-stakeholder partnerships here, like the Alliance 8.7, for example, where I understand all our organizations that are today on this panel are party to. So that's a way to use the networks that we all have to identify potential victims or people that are in risk of being left behind, identify them and work with the organizations that are closest to them to include them into their policies that will give them a voice and will give them a power to negotiate their rights, and ideally collectively in the framework of freedom of association and collective bargaining. That would be my quick answer to this. It's much more complex, but that would be a first step, I think.
Okay. And, you know, I like to give the last word to a woman. So, Justine, that's you. And one policy area that's really urgent that we could all put our heads together around how we achieve it.
I do think it comes back to one of the areas we talked about earlier, and I think it's around really genuinely creating a living wage for everybody. And I think that's a real challenge. We need to create an environment for change. And I think, you know, we've talked a lot about legislation and about regulatory frameworks, but, you know, it sometimes feels like either it's a tokenistic approach or it's not embedded in the right way. But I think that there really needs to be something around challenging gender stereotypes, you know, all of the issues around systemic discrimination. And, you know, I do actually agree with Jasmine that this issue around education is absolutely vital. So we have to offer an alternative, but we also have to embed those core practices around living wage and making sure that genuinely we give everybody, you know, the best possible start, both in life, but then also through their working career, and making sure that people don't have to make those terrible and difficult decisions just in order to, you know, maintain their family or keep a roof over their heads.
What a perfect outcome, and music to my ears on the World Day for Decent Work. A living wage for everybody. Let's make it happen. What a fabulous panel. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to you. Jasmine, Diana, Thomas, you know, Justine, Sean and Yvonne. You're all terrific. We are so grateful for the work you do and many millions more of you around the world. So, you know, let me have the last word to the victims of modern slavery. We stand with you because in the end, this is simply dehumanizing exploitation and it can't have any place in our world. So thank you to the C20, thank you to the Secretariat, but a great panel, everybody.